The air in the Fort Liberty dining facility was thick with the smells of industrial-grade chili mac and lukewarm coffee. It was a symphony of institutional odors, a blend of bleach, steam, and the faint, metallic tang of stress. Sunlight, hazy with Carolina humidity, streamed through the tall, grime-streaked windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like lazy, microscopic spirits. The noise was a constant, rolling tide, the scrape of metal chairs on linoleum, the clatter of trays, the low murmur of hundreds of conversations blending into a single, indecipherable drone. She sat alone at a small table near the back, a position that offered a clear view of the entrances and the flow of traffic. Her name was Elena, and she looked like she belonged to the background. Her hair, once a dark brown, was now generously threaded with silver and pulled back in a severe, functional bun. Wrinkles fanned from the corners of her eyes, not from laughter, but from years of squinting into unforgiving suns and peering through scopes. She wore an old set of Army combat uniforms, the universal camouflage pattern that the Army had phased out years ago. The fabric was worn soft, faded to a pale, ghostly version of its original pixelated gray. It was clean, meticulously pressed, but undeniably old. She moved with an economy that bordered on stillness. Her fork rose and fell with methodical precision, carrying a small portion of overcooked green beans to her mouth. Her back was perfectly straight, a rigid line that seemed at odds with her otherwise unassuming appearance. Her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, were never still. They swept the room in a slow, constant, unconscious pattern, cataloging faces, noting postures, assessing the subtle dynamics of the crowded hall. She wasn't looking for trouble. She was simply incapable of not looking. It was a reflex etched into her nervous system, as involuntary as breathing. Today was an anniversary, a quiet, personal one that required her presence on base. It was a day for ghosts, and wearing the old uniform was a part of that ritual. A silent communion with a past that felt both a lifetime away and as immediate as the fork in her hand. She ate not for pleasure, but for fuel, her mind 1,000 miles and a dozen years away from the clatter of the DFAC. The disturbance started as a shift in the room's energy, a subtle change in the ambient noise that her senses snagged instantly. It was a pocket of tension in the otherwise uniform hum. Her gaze drifted, without haste, toward the source. 4 of them. Lieutenants, by the fresh gold bars on their collars. They were young, their faces still smooth with the arrogance of recent graduation from West Point. Their uniforms were sharp, new, the operational camouflage pattern crisp and dark. They moved with a swagger that broadcasted their belief in their own nascent authority. They had cornered a young private. He couldn't have been more than 19. His face was a mess of flushed skin and panicked eyes. He'd spilled a drink, it seemed. A dark soda stain was spreading across the front of the lead lieutenant's pristine uniform blouse. The private held a dripping cup, his hands trembling as he stammered apologies. The lead lieutenant, a man with a square jaw and an expression of profound irritation, leaned into the private's personal space. His name tag read Miller. "What is wrong with you, Private? Are your hands just for decoration? Do you see this? This is a uniform. It's meant to be worn with pride, not used as your personal splash pad." His voice wasn't a yell, but it was loud enough to carry, designed to be overheard, to perform his authority for the audience. His 3 companions chuckled, forming a loose, intimidating semicircle around the boy. One of them, a lanky lieutenant with glasses, chimed in. "Maybe he thinks it's the new aquatic camo, sir. Top secret." The private, whose name tag identified him as Evans, was shrinking into himself. "I'm so sorry, sir. It was an accident. I tripped. I can pay for the cleaning, sir." "Pay for the cleaning?" Miller scoffed, a theatrical sound. "You think this is about money, Private? This is about discipline. Attention to detail. Something you clearly know nothing about. Now drop and give me 20. Right here. Right now." Private Evans's eyes widened. The floor was slick with spilled soda and tracked in grit. Doing push-ups there was pure humiliation. He hesitated, his gaze darting around the room, pleading for an intervention that would not come. The other soldiers in the hall pointedly looked down at their trays or started conversations with their neighbors. No one wanted a piece of an angry lieutenant. Elena watched. Her expression did not change. She observed the power dynamic, the casual cruelty, the boy's fear. She saw the way Miller puffed out his chest, enjoying the moment. This was not about discipline. It was about ego. She continued to eat her green beans, one by one. The boy was about to drop to the floor, his face a mask of shame. She set her fork down. The small metallic sound was inaudible in the noisy room, but the action was decisive. She rose from her chair, her movements fluid and silent. She picked up her tray and walked toward the tray return, a path that would take her directly past the small drama. She did not look at the lieutenants as she approached. Her focus was on a point on the far wall. She moved with a steady, unhurried pace, an unremarkable older woman in a faded uniform. As she passed, she spoke, her voice low and even, not directed at anyone in particular but loud enough for the group to hear. A leader corrects in private and praises in public, Lieutenant. The words hung in the air for a moment. They were not an order, not a challenge. They were a simple statement of fact. Miller stopped his tirade. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as they took in Elena. He scanned her from head to toe. He saw the faded UCP, the worn boots, the silver in her hair. He saw a relic. A has-been. Or maybe a never was. A reservist, perhaps, or some rear-echelon logistics officer from a forgotten era. "Excuse me," Miller said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Did you say something, ma'am?" He emphasized that ma'am with a particular kind of insolence, turning it from a term of respect into an insult, a label for an old, irrelevant woman. Elena stopped and turned to face him fully. Her eyes met his. They were flat, devoid of emotion. I observed a public correction. I offered a principle of leadership. She did not raise her voice. She did not gesture. She simply stood there, a pillar of calm. Miller's lips curled into a smirk. He looked at his buddies, sharing the joke. A principle of leadership. And what would you know about that? He gestured dismissively at her uniform. Look at this. You're wearing a museum piece. They stopped issuing that garbage when I was in high school. You some kind of history enthusiast? The other lieutenants snickered. The lanky one adjusted his glasses. Maybe she just got lost on her way to the surplus store. Private Evans, forgotten for a moment, looked from the lieutenants to Elena, his eyes wide with a new kind of fear. He was now the cause of a confrontation between an officer and whatever she was. Elena's gaze remained fixed on Miller. This uniform is authorized for wear on specific occasions. Oh, authorized. Miller mocked, taking a step closer. He was a head taller than her, broader in the shoulders. He was using his size to intimidate, a classic bully's tactic. And who authorized you? The Grand Army of the Republic. You need to learn your place. NCOs, and whatever you are, don't lecture officers. Especially not lieutenants who are trying to instill some discipline in this new, soft generation of soldier. The infraction was minor. The response was disproportionate, Elena stated. Her tone was clinical, as if she were describing a weather pattern. It served no purpose other than to humiliate the soldier and gratify your ego. That is not leadership. It is abuse of authority. The smirk vanished from Miller's face. His jaw tightened. The word abuse had struck a nerve. You have a sharp tongue, for an old lady. You're out of line. What's your name and unit? Elena did not answer. She simply held his gaze. Her silence was more infuriating to him than any shouted retort could have been. It was a denial. A refusal to play his game, to acknowledge his authority over her. I asked you a question, he snapped, his voice rising. The pretense of cool command was gone, replaced by raw anger. He took another step, closing the distance between them until he was looming over her. You will show me some respect. Respect is earned, Lieutenant. It is not a function of the rank on your collar. That was it. That was the final insult. For Miller, rank was everything. It was the foundation of his world, the source of his pride and his power. To have it dismissed so casually, by this woman in a faded, archaic uniform, was intolerable. You know what, he said, his voice a low growl. I think you're not even authorized to be on this post. I think you're a fake. A stolen valor case, he reached out, his fingers aiming for the subdued flag patch on her right sleeve. "Let's see what other antique patches you've got sewn on here." He never touched it. The moment his hand moved, something changed in Elena. It was not a large movement. It was a microscopic shift, a realignment of molecules. Her posture, already perfect, seemed to settle, her center of gravity dropping an imperceptible inch. Her breathing, which had been slow and steady, hitched for a fraction of a second and then resumed, deeper, calmer. Her eyes, which had been flat and observational, sharpened to a razor's edge. The ambient light of the room seemed to coalesce into two tiny, hard points in her pupils. The switch had been flipped. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. For the stunned onlookers in the dining hall, it was a blur of motion too fast to properly comprehend. But in a clinical, slow-motion deconstruction, it was a sequence of brutally efficient, perfectly executed techniques. As Miller's fingers came within an inch of her sleeve, Elena's left hand moved. It was not a slap or a block. It was a gentle-looking interception. Her fingers wrapped around his wrist, but not in a grip of strength. Her thumb found the pressure point over the radial nerve. She applied a minimal, precise amount of pressure. A bolt of white-hot, paralyzing fire shot up Miller's arm. His nervous system screamed. His fingers, which had been reaching, curled into a useless claw. A grunt of agony escaped his lips, his eyes wide with shock and pain. He tried to pull back, but her grip, though it looked relaxed, was like a clamp of forged steel. Simultaneously, her right foot slid behind his left ankle. As he instinctively leaned forward from the pain in his wrist, she pivoted. It wasn't a kick or a trip. It was a simple application of leverage, a redirection of his own forward momentum. His body followed the path of least resistance, his balance utterly compromised. He went down. Hard. The back of his head connected with the linoleum floor with a sickening, wet thud. He lay there, dazed, the world spinning. The lanky lieutenant with the glasses reacted a half-second later, his mind struggling to catch up. He lunged forward, his arms outstretched as if to grab her. He was clumsy, fueled by adrenaline and a misguided sense of camaraderie. Elena had already turned to face him, releasing Miller's wrist as he fell. As the lanky lieutenant came in, she took a single step to her left, letting his momentum carry him past her. Her right hand came up, not in a fist, but with her fingers extended and rigid. She struck him precisely at the brachial plexus origin point, just to the side of his neck. It was not a full-force blow. It was a targeted, disabling tap. His entire left arm went numb, as if it had been struck by lightning. The sudden, shocking loss of motor control sent a wave of panic through his brain. He stumbled, his legs turning to rubber, and collapsed into a heap next to a table, clutching his dead arm, his glasses askew on his face. The third and fourth lieutenants had frozen, their mouths agape. They had been observers, cheerleaders, and now they were participants in a disaster. The third one, a stocky man with a thick neck, finally broke his paralysis and charged, letting out a wordless yell. Elena met his charge. She didn't retreat. She didn't brace. She flowed. As he reached for her, she dropped her weight, her right hand shooting under his arm and clamping onto the fabric of his uniform at the shoulder. Her left hand found his hip. Using his own forward momentum against him, she spun, a perfectly executed hip throw. The stocky lieutenant became airborne for a brief, bewildering moment before slamming onto his back on an empty table. Trays, salt shakers, and plastic cups flew into the air. The table groaned under the impact but held. He lay there, the wind knocked out of him, gasping like a landed fish. The fourth lieutenant, seeing his 3 comrades neutralized in the span of a few heartbeats, did the only sensible thing he could. He took a stumbling step back, his hands raised in a gesture of absolute surrender. His face was pale, his bravado evaporated. He looked at Elena not as an old woman, but as some kind of monster. Elena stood in the small circle of carnage she had created. Her breathing was even. Her hair was still in its perfect bun. She was not flushed, not angry, not triumphant. Her expression was exactly as it had been before, a mask of calm, professional observation. She straightened the sleeve of her old uniform blouse, a small, unconscious gesture. The dining hall had gone completely, utterly silent. The scraping of chairs, the clatter of trays, the hum of conversation, all of it had ceased. Hundreds of soldiers and officers sat frozen, their forks halfway to their mouths, their eyes wide with disbelief. The only sounds were the pained groans of the lieutenant on the floor and the ragged gasps of the one on the table. Time seemed to stretch, the silence amplifying the shock of what they had just witnessed. They had seen a bar fight. This was not that. This was different. This was precise. It was controlled. It was terrifyingly efficient. It was the work of a professional, and it had been performed by the last person in the room anyone would have expected. Then, from a table in the corner, a new sound emerged. The scrape of a chair. A man stood up. He was a full-bird colonel, his uniform immaculate, his face a roadmap of hard-won experience. His name tag read Davies. He was an older man, close to retirement, with the kind of quiet authority that needed no performance. He had seen the entire exchange from the beginning. Colonel Davies placed his napkin on his tray and began to walk toward the scene. He moved with a purpose that parted the stunned soldiers like a ship through water. He did not look at the downed lieutenants. His eyes were fixed on Elena. His expression was not one of shock, but of dawning, profound recognition. He stopped a few feet from her. His gaze dropped from her face to her left sleeve. The lieutenants had only seen a faded, old uniform. Colonel Davies saw something else. His eyes, trained by decades of service and briefings in secure rooms, narrowed. He saw the ghost of a patch that had been removed, its outline still visible in the faded fabric. But just below it, on the cuff, was a small, unassuming badge. It was a simple design, a trident, but it was rendered in black, subdued thread, almost invisible against the camouflage unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. "My God," Colonel Davies breathed, his voice a quiet rumble that nonetheless seemed to echo in the silent hall. He looked up from the badge to her face. "I've heard stories, but I never thought." The trident on the cuff. The night owl device. He took a half step back, an unconscious gesture of deference. His posture shifted. He was no longer a senior officer observing a disturbance. He was a soldier in the presence of a legend. "Major Petrova," he said, his voice filled with a respect that bordered on awe. The use of her rank, Major, cut through the tension. "It is an honor, ma'am." Elena gave him a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was the first acknowledgement she had given anyone. The fourth lieutenant, still standing with his hands up, stared at the colonel, then back at Elena. "Major." "Sir, she's not a major. She's just some old." His voice trailed off as he saw the look on the colonel's face. "Lieutenant," Colonel Davies said, his voice turning to ice. "Shut your mouth. You are standing in the presence of Major Elena Petrova. She was a Tier 1 operator with the Joint Special Operations Command. The uniform she is wearing is the one she wore in the Tangi Valley. The badge on her sleeve is one of fewer than 10 ever issued. You and your friends didn't just disrespect a senior officer. You disrespected a living hero of the Republic." The colonel's words dropped into the silence like stones into a deep well. Tier 1. JSOC. The terms rippled through the room, passed in hushed whispers. The elite of the elite. The ghosts. The people whose files were classified above top secret. The soldiers in the room, from the lowest private to the highest ranking officer, understood. They were looking at something impossibly rare. The wail of sirens grew louder from outside. Someone had called the military police. 2 MPs, young specialists with polished helmets and an air of serious importance, entered the DFAC at a jog. They saw the scene, 3 officers on the ground, one standing with his hands up, a colonel, and an older woman in a faded uniform at the center of it all, and they slowed to a cautious walk. "Sir," the lead MP said, addressing Colonel Davies as the senior officer present. "We got a call about a disturbance." "There was a disturbance, Specialist," Davies said, his voice flat and authoritative. These 4 lieutenants were engaged in conduct unbecoming of an officer. They were publicly harassing a junior enlisted soldier and then proceeded to assault a senior field-grade officer. The MP's eyes widened. He looked at Elena, then at the downed lieutenants, his brain trying to make sense of the colonel's statement. "Assaulted her, sir." Lieutenant Miller, Davies said, pointing a rigid finger at the groaning men on the floor, initiated physical contact with Major Petrova. "She defended herself," he paused, then added with clinical precision, effectively. The MPs exchanged a look. This was far above their pay grade. One of them keyed his radio, his voice low and urgent. "Dispatch, be advised, we have a situation at DFAC 3. 4 lieutenants are down. A full bird Colonel N, a JSOC operator are on scene. Requesting the Provost Marshal and the battalion commander." The term JSOC over the radio would have sent a jolt through the entire chain of command. Within minutes, the dining hall was no longer a cafeteria but a formal crime scene. More MPs arrived, followed by a very stressed-looking captain, the company commander for the lieutenants, and then a lieutenant colonel, their battalion commander, his face a thundercloud. The investigation was swift and brutally one-sided. Every soldier in the room who was interviewed told the exact same story. They told of the lieutenants bullying Private Evans. They told of the quiet woman's simple, calm request for them to stop. They recounted Miller's escalating aggression, his insults, his attempt to grab her. And they described the takedown, each witness using words like instantaneous, professional, and unbelievable. Private Evans, now standing near Colonel Davies for protection, gave his statement, his voice trembling but clear. He confirmed every detail. Finally, the Provost Marshal, a major with sharp, intelligent eyes, approached Elena. He and the battalion commander stood before her, their demeanors a mixture of official duty and profound caution. Colonel Davies stood beside her, a silent, immovable ally. "Ma'am," the Provost Marshal began, his voice carefully neutral. "Major Petrova. We need to get your official statement. And we'll need to see your credentials, just for the record." Elena reached into a small pocket on her pants and produced a military ID card. It looked like any other common access card, but when the MP captain scanned it with his handheld device, the screen didn't just bring up her profile. It flashed bright red. A series of warnings scrolled across the small screen. Alpha level clearance. Do not detain. Do not question. Notify JSOC Command S1 immediately. Lethal force authorized. The captain's blood ran cold. He showed the screen to the Provost Marshal, whose face went pale. They were no longer investigating an assault. They were standing on the edge of a classified world they were not cleared to even comprehend. The battalion commander, a man used to being the ultimate authority in any room, looked at Elena with new eyes. He cleared his throat. "Major Petrova. On behalf of my command, I sincerely apologize for the inexcusable actions of my lieutenants. Their behavior was a disgrace to the uniform and to this army. They will be dealt with to the fullest extent of the Uniform Code of Military Justice." Elena looked at him, her expression unreadable. "They are young, Colonel. Full of pride, lacking in wisdom. They confused authority with power." "That is not an excuse, ma'am," the battalion commander insisted. "They crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. Assaulting a fellow soldier, let alone an officer of your status," he couldn't even bring himself to say the words. "Their careers are over. We'll be recommending general court-martial." "Will you be pressing charges, Major?" the Provost Marshal asked quietly. A long silence fell. Elena's gaze drifted past the officers to the 4 lieutenants. Miller was now sitting up, a large goose egg forming on the back of his head, his face a mask of dazed humiliation. The lanky one was being tended to by a medic, his arm still useless. The stocky one was nursing his ribs. The 4th was simply staring at the floor, his world in ruins. They had been arrogant, cruel, and stupid. And now they were broken. "No," Elena said finally. The single word was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute finality. The officers looked at her, stunned. "Ma'am," the battalion commander asked. "They assaulted you. Their punishment will be the memory of this day," she said, her voice even. "It will be the knowledge of their failure, a lesson more permanent than anything a court-martial could impose. They thought strength was about shouting and shoving. They learned that real strength is control. The lesson has been administered. There is no need for anything further." She did not say it with pity. She said it with the detached finality of a surgeon closing an incision. The procedure was over. The subject would recover, or it would not. The outcome was no longer her concern. With that, she turned to Private Evans. The boy flinched as she approached, still intimidated. She stopped in front of him. "Keep your head up, soldier. Do your duty. Don't let men like that define your service." "Yes, ma'am," he whispered, his eyes shining with unshed tears. She gave him a curt nod, then turned to leave. The crowd of soldiers parted for her, a path of silent respect clearing toward the exit. The battalion commander and the provost marshal simply stood and watched her go. They knew they had no authority to stop her. Colonel Davies fell into step beside her as she walked out into the bright, humid afternoon. They walked in silence for a moment, the sounds of the dining hall fading behind them. "That was a hell of a thing to see, Elena," Davies said quietly, using her first name. It was clear they had some shared history, however distant. "I haven't seen Systema utilized that cleanly since a training exercise in Hereford." "It is a useful skill," she replied, her voice neutral. "They left me no other option. They crossed the line." "They were fools," Davies agreed. "Spoiled children playing soldier. They never stood a chance." He looked at her, at the faded uniform and the quiet strength in her face. "It's good to see you, Major. Even under these circumstances. I'm sorry your day of remembrance was disturbed." "It wasn't disturbed, Colonel," she said, stopping by a nondescript sedan in the parking lot. "It was a reminder. A reminder of why we fought. To protect the weak from the arrogant. To ensure that strength is tempered with wisdom." She looked back toward the base, a sprawling city of power and youth. "Sometimes, the children just need to be reminded of what true strength looks like." Colonel Davies stood straighter. He looked at the woman before him, this quiet legend hiding in plain sight. He saw the ghosts in her eyes, the weight of the things she had done and seen. He understood her decision not to press charges. For men like Miller, public humiliation and the death of a career were a fate worse than any brig. Her brand of justice was more personal, and far more profound. He raised his hand to his brow in a slow, perfect salute. It was not the perfunctory gesture between officers. It was a sign of the deepest, most profound respect one warrior could offer another. Elena met his gaze. She did not return the salute. Instead, she gave him another of her small, almost imperceptible nods. It was enough. It was an acknowledgement between peers, an understanding that transcended rank and ceremony. She got into her car and drove away, leaving Colonel Davies standing at attention in the parking lot. He held his salute until her car was out of sight, a lone sentinel paying tribute to a force of nature that had briefly, and decisively, reminded the world that the most dangerous predators are often the ones you never see coming. He finally lowered his hand, a small, grim smile touching his lips. He had a feeling that the story of the quiet woman in the old uniform would become a new kind of legend at Fort Liberty, a cautionary tale whispered in barracks and bars for a generation of new soldiers to come. A lesson about respect, and the quiet, lethal power of control.